Thank you all so much. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I'm thrilled to hear of the diversity of places that many of you have come from all over the world. Maybe Nepal would be the furthest that anyone has come, right? Or India, Syria and India and Brazil. I have traveled the world pretty much, about 92 countries, I think. And there's not a single one I wouldn't go back to at the drop of a hat if I could. So thank you on behalf of FEE for coming to this conference and all this way to Atlanta, Georgia. I'm here to talk to you today for about a half hour before we open it to questions on the matter of the freedom philosophy. That is very important to us at FEE. That's a phrase that our very founder, Leonard Read, no relation, but I did know him. That's a phrase that Leonard used quite frequently. Sometimes he called it the liberty philosophy, other times the freedom philosophy. He used those words interchangeably, although there are nuances to each word, because Leonard felt that it was important for all of us to have a philosophy, or at least one philosophy. You may have multiple philosophies depending upon the particular focus, but they shouldn't, of course, be contradictory to each other. Philosophy, as we know, is the study of such important fundamental aspects of life as the nature of knowledge. How do we know what we know? Other questions often come up in the study of philosophy, such as why are we here? How do we get here? Do we have a purpose? And by what principles should we live? Those are matters that philosophers, of course, deal with at all the time. And I believe very firmly that possessing a philosophy is evidence that you've done some thinking. Have you ever met anybody, maybe advanced in life, maybe in their 50s or 60s, who seem to be proud about the fact that they don't have a consistent set of principles or philosophy? I run into such people like that, and I often, if I have a chance, I ask them a lot of questions. But I mainly want to know, well, you've been given or you've been born with a brain. You have tools that others have developed over the centuries that allow us to use such things as logic and reason to think things through. Why haven't you done so? At age 50 or 60, can you tell me what it is you believe? What is your philosophy, or what is your philosophy about life, at least? And yet, I dare say, I think there are a lot of people who haven't given these things very much thought, and so they end up running in all kinds of contradictory directions. One of my favorite comedians is, this is probably a name you haven't heard because he goes back well before I was born, at least his heyday, and that is Groucho Marx. How many have heard of Groucho Marx? Okay, a few hands. Well, in one of his movies, he portrayed the leader of a fictional country. And he's speaking to some people, and he says at one point, "Those are my principles. If you don't like them, I have others." Which is another way of saying I really don't have any principles, or I'll have just the principles that will make you happy at this moment, and I'll change them at the next moment if there's another audience that wants me to have different principles. Well, that's a person who really doesn't have principles or a life philosophy, perhaps, at all. And that's what I'm objecting to here, and hoping that you all come away from this Active Minds Conference being able to identify what your life philosophy is. At FEE, we like to talk about liberty or freedom as a life philosophy. What does it mean to regard liberty, which you've heard a lot about, I know, at this conference already? What does it mean to regard it as a life philosophy? Well, that certainly elevates liberty to a pretty lofty level, doesn't it? It says that it's not just a view of politics or of reality or of economics or any narrow field like that. It is a view on life itself. Liberty as a life philosophy involves a very broad perspective on life itself. And I want to share with you some of the concepts involved in that. First of all, if you have liberty as a life philosophy, or whatever your life philosophy may be, however you may choose to identify it, I hope you're not a fair weather friend to that philosophy. A fair weather friend is one who says, well, I'm for this, or this is what I believe, but only when the circumstances are favorable. If the times get rough, or if circumstances change, I'll change with the wind. My principles will change, my philosophy will change based upon ephemeral things that come and go. I think a life philosophy ought to be something that you're so convinced, doesn't mean that you don't keep your mind open to new evidence that might suggest a change or a mid-course correction in some way. But once you have come to certain conclusions, you ought to stick by them. Stand for them. Don't be afraid to tell others what your life philosophy is and to engage in discussion about it. And don't think of a life philosophy as something that can be departmentalized, that, well, it only applies here or at certain times or with certain audiences. Then I'd have to question whether or not it really is your philosophy. I remember a soybean farmer not far from where I lived for 30 years in Midland, Michigan. I was running a free market think tank there, and he was a very good friend, and he supported our think tank. He liked the idea of freedom and free markets, but he told me once, and I've ever since used this as an example of an inconsistency in life philosophy. He told me once that, he said, Larry, I'm for free markets in everything but soybeans. In other words, he thought he was doing something that was so special that, the free market principles didn't apply. He applied them elsewhere, but not in his own life, in his principal occupation, which led him to such contradictory assumptions as it's bad for government to subsidize farmers unless they're growing soybeans like me. I mean, how can you ever convince anybody of your philosophy if you can blow holes through it? Because it's so radically inconsistent. Let me suggest to you that at your age, you have decades ahead of you to be crafting and honing and improving, building upon the life philosophy that you choose. And I'm assuming many of you will choose liberty as one of, if not the principal life philosophy. You have the opportunity now to shape yourself and your thinking and your behavior in ways that in 40, 50, or 60 years you'll be able to look back on and offer some kind of an assessment. I hope among the things you'll be able to say at that time will be that once I knew what was right, or once I was convinced that something was right, I stood by it. It became my core philosophy. Come hell or high water, I defended it against all comers. Let me offer you a couple lists of possible epitaphs or inscriptions on your headstone some decades from now. List A involves some epitaphs or phrases that I would hope you wouldn't want on your headstone. And here are 6 of them. He said it, but rarely meant it. Would you want that on your headstone? I don't think so. Who would say, hey, let's pay tribute to this person? He said it, but rarely meant it. In other words, he was a hypocrite. Or, no one ever knew what she stood for. Nothing admirable about that, is there? Or, left the world as if he was never in it.
Oh, wow.
We all want to make a difference, right? Or couldn't see further than herself. Or subtracted more than he added. I don't think that's very admirable, is it? Or honest and upright, but only when others were watching. I would hope you'd prefer something from list B. Okay, and these can emerge if you have a life philosophy that you've thought through, worked out the contradictions so as to be consistent, and courageously apply. This list includes the following. He made bedrock principles soar. Wow, wouldn't that be a great thing for others to say about you? He or she took bedrock principles and gave them life, made them soar, made people say, wow, tell me more. Another one is, what you saw was what she was. No pretense, no prevarication. Wow. Wouldn't you love to have people say that about you? Devoted to all the right things in both word and deed. Loved life and liberty, and others loved him for it. That's one of my favorites. I get goosebumps just thinking about it. I'd love to have that on my headstone. Another one is, she set standards to which every decent person aspires. Or how about this one? The golden rule was his life in 3 words. Those are powerful. I don't think any good, any self-respecting person would want any of those inscriptions on his headstone that came from list A, but would much prefer any of those from list B. You can certainly commit your life to any number of things. You can commit your life to God, to truth, to family, to the future, to liberty. And those things are not necessarily mutually exclusive. I'm not saying you have to pick one and you can't embrace more than one. You certainly can. I just want to make the case here today that liberty is right up there as close to whatever the best thing is as you can get. And I say that because liberty is ultimately what makes life worth living. We take it so for granted in so many parts of the world. But if you think about it, it is really a precious thing, isn't it? It's so precious, and it's so rare historically. If you could go back and count the numbers of people, those who are alive today, something in the neighborhood of 8 billion, and all those who came before, and if you could categorize them as, which ones lived under a system that gave them substantial liberty, where their liberties were largely intact, I dare say, I don't know that anybody's tried to come up with actual numbers, but I think very strongly that if we could put numbers to that, we'd find that a single-digit percentage of people who have ever lived could honestly say they lived in a substantial degree of what we know to be liberty. Wow. I mean, that suggests maybe the natural order of things is the absence of liberty. I don't want to believe that. It's too lofty an ideal that so many, including many of you here, have committed your lives to. And yet, throughout history, very few people could really be said to have had it. Most people have lived as serfs or as slaves or lived in fear, constant fear, of those with political power in one system or another. When you analyze the nature of people, and this is very much a philosophical concept, well, what is the nature of humanity? Are we, for instance, a giant collective blob? Are we like a hive mind? Or in one of the Star Trek movies, the Borg? Or are we, in fact, distinct and unique individuals one to another? Well, I think everybody here knows the answer to that question. But this is more profound than you can imagine. The very observation that people are unique, doesn't matter what the numbers may be of how many who have ever lived, we have no evidence that any 2 people who have ever lived have been identical. Every single person who's ever lived has been different from, in many ways, every other human being. That means that for you to be who you are, the distinct human being that you are, you can't be forced to live somebody else's life. You can't have somebody else dictating to you, living their life through you. You wouldn't be yourself, right? We're not made that way. We're not made as if we are a fleet of robots. with every action, every thought pre-programmed by some mastermind. We're given, whatever you may regard as the source of that, at least each of us possesses an ability to think for ourselves. And we are precious, we are rare, we are unique. No two of us are exactly the same. That means for you to be who you are, or who you were intended to be, you have to enjoy substantial freedom to make choices. The less freedom you have to make choices, the more you're not living your life, somebody else is living their life through you. And if that's the case, we should ask the question, well, why do they get to do that? Why can't I turn it around and live my life through that person? Why can't I tell that person what to do? What gives him the right to dictate to me? And those are questions, of course, that no dictator ever likes to be asked and has never given a satisfactory answer to. A life philosophy, such as that of liberty, is made up, I think, of two components. One component is how you see yourself, and the other component is how you see others. I want to say a word about each of those. How you see yourself. I suppose if I were say a communist or a socialist, I'd probably see myself not as a free and sovereign individual with rights that come with me as a matter of my birth, to live my life peacefully as I see it. I would probably think of myself as a cog in a big machine, as somebody waiting around for orders from the higher-ups who somehow possess some superior knowledge, who, even if their own lives are a mess, somehow know how to run mine. How ridiculous is that? And yet there are tens of millions of people all over the world who, to one degree or another, sort of think and behave in that fashion. They wait for others to tell them what to do because they think that others are possessed of some superior right or knowledge that they don't have. I'm not, as an individual, content to subject myself to the collective will, whatever that is, or anybody else's individual will. I'm not content to sign away my individuality and the rights that come with it because somebody else thinks they have a better idea than me as to how I should live my life. That's part of my life philosophy. I'm a lover of liberty, so I see myself as one of a kind, possessing rights that come naturally to me as a matter of my individuality. I suppose if I were a communist or a socialist or a collectivist of any kind, I might even think of myself as a constant victim. You've met people like that, right, who think of themselves as, oh, somebody's always victimizing me. The world is divided between victims and those who are victimizing them, oppressors and the oppressed, which I think misses an awful lot of wonderful things that happen every day. When people, through their personal initiative, live exciting lives, solve problems, cure diseases, act upon their individuality to be so different and unique as they were intended to be. How many of you have seen the movie? It's now probably 20 years old. It's an animated film called Ants. Anybody? A-N-T-Z? Oh my gosh, that's great. I've long been an advocate of it. That's the only movie I have ever gone to see that I had to pull out whatever paper, I think business cards is what I used, in the middle of the movie to take notes because there were so many fantastic one-liners. But the message of that movie, I think, is powerfully individualistic, anti-collectivist. As you might recall, if you did see it or if you did not, there's an ant colony that's the focus of the movie. And of course, you have the ants at the top who, they're kind of special. They're in charge. They know what everybody else ought to do. They've programmed everybody to just, do as they are instructed by those with power. But it turns out there's one ant known as Z, A-N-T-Z is the movie title, who right from the start sees himself as different, unique. He rebels against this notion that he should simply follow the commands of somebody else and behave no differently than those other worker ants or whatever category you may fall into. And of course, he runs afoul of the people or the ants with political power. But in the end, when the colony is endangered by an invader, the great message of the movie comes through. It's that single ant, it's Z, who exerts his individuality and saves the colony because he takes initiative. He's different. He doesn't just follow orders. I'll never forget, to give you a real-life example of this very point, there was a German, this was in the late 80s, by the name of Matthias Rust, R-U-S-T. He's still living. And when Gorbachev was head of the Soviet Union and things were beginning to fall apart, people were exerting a desire to have more freedoms in the Soviet Union as it began to break up. Matthias Rust was a pilot who decided he was going to fly from, I think it was one of the Scandinavian countries, or maybe it was his native Germany. He was going to fly hundreds of miles across Russia and land in Red Square in downtown Moscow. Now, you'd think, how could anybody do that? He'd be shot down within the first mile. He made it all the way to Red Square. And when he landed the plane and got out, what do you think happened? You might expect, probably the cops were all over him immediately, right? He probably didn't get more than a few steps away from the plane before the cops came down on him because they were everywhere, even in those late days of the old Soviet Union. That's not what happened. Why? Because in the collectivist culture of the old Soviet Union, landing a plane in Red Square was not in the book. And so people said, this must be the way it's supposed to be. The things don't happen here unless the top people at the top order it. So he must be okay. So even the cops at first didn't arrest him or anything. He ran around Red Square taking pictures. And he had just invaded Russian airspace, but the fact that he landed a little Cessna four-seater in Red Square was simply not in the manual that the top brass had ever contemplated. Now, he was eventually arrested, but I thought that initial reaction was very telling, very telling. Here's an individual who does something daring, and the collective mind can't deal with it because it's not in the book. Well, I also think that having liberty as a philosophy should suggest to you that you ought to have purposes in life. Whether your purpose is to raise a large and wonderful family or to explore the heavens as an astrophysicist or to advance liberty in speeches and writing, whatever your purpose is, I think it's motivating and animating to people to think of themselves as here with a purpose. You're not, now I'm betraying my own personal belief here. I happen to be a Christian, so I believe very strongly that we each are here to fulfill a purpose, to find what it is, and to use the faculties that make us up as individuals to further advance not only ourselves, but those around us. So you can be a superb parent or a fantastic teacher, a remarkable influencer, a great friend, a wonderful inventor, a producer, innovator, somebody who adds value to society as an entrepreneur, any number of other things. But don't go through life thinking that you're just one of 8 billion with no particular purpose and just coasting from one day to the next. You're too valuable as a unique and precious person to not put all your faculties to good use. Now, that's a little bit about how you see yourself. I'm suggesting that a person who embraces liberty as a life philosophy will see themselves as, wow, I can do things, I can innovate, I can be a great person, I can be emulated by others because they see me as a good example. So I'm going to get to work on that. But the other component of a life philosophy, or liberty as a life philosophy, is how you see others. And have you ever noticed that those of a very different persuasion, who have not yet come to accept liberty as a high value, who may be very collectivist in their thinking, have you ever noticed certain traits that seem to be common among them that are turn-offs in any way? I mean, we should be seeking out people we disagree with and trying to win them over to our side. But along the way, you may notice that those in our midst who have a much more collectivist philosophy, they often don't have much respect for other individuals. Because after all, individuals really are just cogs in the big machine, right? Your purpose is to do what you're told by the elite, by the smart, by the highly educated, or the highly motivated, or the egalitarians among us. But if you're a lover of liberty, and you practice liberty as a life philosophy, I think you must have respect for others. You realize that, hey, just as I am a unique individual possessing rights that come with me as a matter of existence and my birth, so do you. And I'm going to respect you the same way I would hope you would respect me. I think it's a measure of our character that we deal with others with the loftiest of standards. That's where I think the golden rule, which is so universal across many faiths and even lack of faith, it's so crucial. Doing unto others as you would have others do unto you. That's a measure, I think, of personal character. And I need to work this towards a conclusion, so I have mentioned the term character, and that's where I'd like to focus my remaining comments. And before we open it to questions, what time is it? Oh, yeah, I'm almost out of time. With the passage of years, in my case, a lot more than you've experienced so far, I'm now in my 71st, but it's become ever more apparent in recent decades to me that this element of character is more important than I ever comprehended it was, as recently as, say, 30, 40 years ago. It's one of those things, one of the most important things over which you have the most direct and powerful control, your character. We're all affected by our environment in some ways. And as we're growing up, of course, we're heavily under the influence of our parents or our families or our relatives. But at some point in everybody's life, there comes a point where you can be considered an adult and you're in charge. And a lot of what your personality is going to look like for the decades to come is going to be shaped by you. You don't ever give up on the idea that you can change even the nastiest of characters into something much more admirable if you take charge. Now, the question about character is, well, what is that? What is character? We use that term in a lot of different ways, don't we? Have you ever heard somebody say of another person, oh, he's a character? And we usually mean by that, well, that person is eccentric or funny or different, odd in some way, usually in a positive way. But you can have bad character too. In fact, you can be a person of very bad character. You can be a character, I should say, and not have very much of it, and not very much of the good kind of character that I want to focus on here. So I want to talk about, in the final minutes that I have here, the character traits that I think you will find most important in determining your success, and also that are important in the success of any free society. They are critical to a life philosophy that revolves around liberty. So important, in fact, that without these character traits that I'm going to tell you about, without these character traits being widely embraced and practiced, I don't think liberty is possible. I don't know, in fact, of any society in history that rose to greatness, and I mean greatness here in a very positive way, making the world a better place. I don't know of a society that ever rose to what I would call greatness that did it in the absence of widespread personal character. And I know even more assuredly that no society ever lost its character, as I will define it, and kept its liberties. Liberty and character, I hope you'll see, are two sides of the same coin in many respects. You have to have character in order for liberty to emerge. because people who lack character are probably going to be thieves or disrespectful of others, or in various ways are not going to be amenable to the principles of a free society. And you have to have liberty, so we find out whether or not you've got character, right? How do we know if you're a person of character if you're not in charge of the major choices and a lot of the minor ones that involve your life? So in some ways, they're two sides of the same coin. Here are some traits that I think are important both to your personal character and to a society rooted in liberty. One is honesty, commitment to the truth. Not his truth, her truth, or some group's truth, but rather the truth. Now, you hear a lot of those other phrases these days. People say, oh, he spoke his truth. Every time I hear that, I want to ask, well, was it the truth? Because if it wasn't, I think he needs to change something. He needs to get with the program. I think seeking the truth is a critical aspect of solid character. And ignoring it or fighting it or paying no attention to what's truthful is not a prescription for either personal success or a free society. Honesty, putting truth on a pedestal, representing a value that is valuable in and of itself, something we should strive for, something we should try to identify and uphold, is critical to a free society. Just think of the opposite of that. How could you have liberty in a society where the great majority of people don't value truth, where they've decided either overtly in their thinking process or just by the way they behave that truth doesn't matter, that you can toss it away, no problem, no consequences, anytime it may seem convenient or anytime it stands in the way of some short-term advantage you might have before you. Can you imagine living in such a society? How could you make an agreement with anybody? You couldn't shake hands and walk away thinking, I can take that person's word for it. Not in a society of liars. So honesty is important. I remember going to Cambodia in 1989. One of my assignments from a local group of people was to take some letters with cash in them to 4 different Cambodian families. Because every time these families who were now living in the United States, every time they sent something to their relatives back in Cambodia, if it had any money in the envelope, it usually didn't get there. So I was trusted with 4 envelopes to get to each one to a different family with several $100s in each envelope. And I was told, don't come back with any of the money. If you can't find a particular family, bring the letter back if you want. But there's so many people in Cambodia who could use the money. If you find a worthy person, leave it with them. The night before I was to leave, I had 1 envelope that I was not able to find a family for. It had $200 in it. And I was faced with the issue of, well, what do I do with it? Who do I give the $200 to? There was a man who'd been giving me a ride in his rickshaw, or siklo, as they call them in Cambodia. Almost every day when I needed a ride, he would be at the hotel, and so he spoke enough English. We had brief conversations. He struck me as an honest guy, a decent person. You know how you get that feeling sometimes? And I didn't know for sure, but the night before I left the country, I gave him that last envelope. And I said, if you can get this to the family that it's addressed to in Battambang, quite a ways away from the capital, there's $200 in it. You can keep 50 of it. I know this guy was as poor as dirt. At $50 at that time was, several months' salary for the typical Cambodian. Then I left the country. And what would you expect most people would assume happened to the $200 and that letter? Probably would never hear about it, and maybe the guy would keep it. But several months later, I got a call from one of the people who trusted me with those envelopes with that money. She wanted to read to me a letter that came from the family in Battambang to their relatives in the United States. In particular, in one paragraph, the writers said, "Thank you for the $200. What did that say? That guy who didn't have 2 cents of his own not only delivered the letter, he didn't even keep the $50 I trusted him with. And I've often thought to this day, if my life was ever in his hands for any reason, I'd have no hesitation in trusting it with him. A person who is so honest in such ways when no one is looking is, I think, a mighty fine individual. Wouldn't you love to live in a world where you could trust everybody that way, where honesty was so valued? Of course we would. You'd have a chance to be free, too, because in an honest society, people can make contracts, engage in commercial transactions, take each other's word to the bank. Real quick, some other character traits that are so important that it's never too soon to try to cultivate is humility. And I don't mean humility by running yourself down. I don't mean that at all. I mean humility in an intellectual sense. How many of you have read I, Pencil by Leonard Reed? Okay, you know one of the messages of I, Pencil is that no matter how many degrees you may have after your name, no matter how many PhDs you may have, or how much knowledge is in your head, there is still an infinite universe of information and knowledge that you don't yet know. And that'll be just as true the day you check out as it was the day you were born. A person who understands that begins to realize, in most cases, that since he's not a know-it-all, he's not a busybody, why try to meddle in the affairs of other people? Why not focus instead on self-improvement? And if you devote your whole life to self-improvement, at least in a knowledge sense, you'll still never get to where you can say you know everything. It's a lifelong task to learn as much as you can, and there'll be as much that you don't know at the end as there was when you started. An unhumble society, what would that look like? Could you have freedom among an unhumble people? Unhumble people are condescending. They are know-it-alls. They think they know what's best for you. Their own lives may be a mess, but they think they can fix yours. They think they know what's best for you. They're not content to let you work it out. They want to dictate to you how you should live because they think they know best. I don't think you can have a society rooted in liberty if people think of their fellow human beings in that fashion. Responsibility is another important character trait. The idea that you hold yourself accountable, that you learn from your mistakes. First of all, recognizing that you do make mistakes. It's amazing how many people I run into that they seem to think they never make a mistake. But responsibility means you say, if I made a mistake, I'm going to own up to it. I'm going to benefit not only from my good judgments, but I'm also going to benefit by my bad ones, by owning up to them and trying to learn from them. An irresponsible society is not likely to be a free one, because you'd have people running around saying, oh, it's your fault, even if it wasn't. It's not my fault, it's your fault. You owe me a living. I'm entitled. Give me something. I'm special. You know, any society perhaps can bear up under the weight of a few who behave that way, but not if the many think and act in that fashion. Your liberties will soon be lost. I think for obvious reasons. The chaos that such mentalities would produce would be incompatible with a free society. I think courage is another attribute of character. Courage. You know, we live in a dangerous world, always have. The world is full of people in every country who, if they thought they had the chance, would be happy to take your life or your property or your rights, which means that if you believe in liberty, you've got to defend it. You can't run from it. When it's under assault, you must rise to its defense. It's that important because life without liberty is just unthinkable, so we must defend it. Just try to imagine for a moment, what would it be like to live in a society where there is no liberty, where your every action is monitored, watched, reported, where everything you do is the result of somebody either ordering you to do it or ordering you not to do it, where at any turn you could be hauled off and put in prison or worse simply because of an idea that you have in your head. That's the way much of the world has lived. And so if we want to believe in liberty, we've got to rise to the occasion and defend it. be courageous. Doesn't mean to be offensive. Doesn't mean you have to be in your face. That's not usually a good tactic for winning somebody over to your way of thinking. But when liberty is challenged, we cannot run from the challenge if we expect to keep it. A timid people will not for long in a dangerous world be a free people. Optimism is another character trait. I try to tell audiences everywhere who often are pessimistic. Haven't you run into people who think, oh, we're going to hell in a handbasket. Everything's going bad. The future's pretty gloomy. You see a lot of that. But I always tell people, first of all, why write off the future when you don't know what it's going to be like yet? Why give up on it when it hasn't happened yet? When you still have an opportunity to shape it, to change it, to make it better. And furthermore, if you adopt a pessimistic attitude, that has a couple very negative consequences. If you're pessimistic, first of all, you probably will not fight hard for what you know to be right, because you've already given up. So it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you're not going to fight for what you know to be right, well, then what's wrong is probably what's going to happen. And secondly, if you have any notion in you of a cause, something that you are so committed to you want to advance and see others embrace, you're not going to be successful at that if you exude an attitude of pessimism. If I came here today and said to you, I want to sign you all up for the cause of liberty, but then I added, oh, by the way, I have to tell you, we're going to lose. I mean, how many of you would say, yeah, sign me up? I mean, people want to know that we can win, and we can win. And there have been many times in history when all seemed to be lost. But good people who didn't give up, who kept an optimistic outlook on life, knew they could still change the future if they worked at it, they didn't give up. I am so energized when I see that attitude among people, especially oppressed peoples. I remember visiting with people who were active in Poland in the underground in the communist days, in the late 80s when I visited that country for the first time. I remember here it was under martial law, communist dictatorship. Even if many people thought even if we could get rid of the communist regime in Warsaw, we'd have to contend with the one in Moscow, who would probably just install another one. And I met with such people who were active fighting all of that, and I said such things as, are you optimistic? You're up against the Army, Navy, and the Air Force of the evil empire. How could you hope to win? Just to test them and see. Time and again, I heard things like, we don't care. We don't know if liberty will be achieved in our lifetimes, but we know what's right. And we want to be able someday to go to our reward and say we did everything we thought we could on behalf of what we know to be right, liberty being one of those things. And one evening in that first visit to Poland in the communist days, I met with a couple who were active in running an underground radio until they were detected and arrested. Can you imagine this? In a communist country, you go underground to run a radio station, to broadcast a message that the government doesn't want people to hear. You're just talking about things all of us take for granted about basic liberty, but you could be hauled off. In fact, they were. They were detected, arrested. He was given 4 years in prison. She was given 3, kept in solitary confinement, apart from each other for much of the time. They were not out of prison very long when I was in their apartment, and there they were, active again, not in radio, but in other ways on behalf of the liberty they felt so enamored with, that they wanted to see someday in their country. And at one point I asked them, when you were broadcasting a message of liberty on the radio, that illegal underground radio, how did you know if people were listening? Think about that. You're running an underground illegal radio. You can't advertise. You can't go out in the streets and conduct a survey. Hey, did you hear our program last night? I mean, the cops would haul you off in no time at all. And Sophia, the woman, answered that question this way. When I said, how did you know if you were being listened to? She said, we wondered that too. But one evening while we were broadcasting, we asked people on the air, if you believe in liberty for Poland, the message of our radio, will you please blink your lights? Call your friends who are of the same view and ask them to do the same. And then she said, we then went to the window, and for hours, all of Warsaw was blinking. Oh my gosh, 3 years later, they were free. In great measure because of the courage, the optimism, the perseverance of people like that couple. And finally, the last trait that I want to mention with you that's so important to character. Oh, yeah, I can't believe what time it is. But real quick, gratitude. Gratitude. Having a grateful spirit, a thankful spirit. You might think, well, what's that got to do with anything? How much difference can that make? Well, a team of bioethicists a few years ago actually studied this for years. And the result was a book that enjoyed some degree of popularity in which they presented their findings. And in it, they said, possessing a grateful or thankful spirit can add as much as 7 years to your life. They felt they had the biochemical evidence to suggest this very strongly. Think of it. Gratitude is what? It's the recognition that not all the good things that have come your way have been entirely of your own doing. Somebody else did something. Maybe it was your parents who were probably doing something on your behalf every day for many, many years. Or it was somebody who invented something. It was an entrepreneur who created an enterprise and provided you employment or whatever. There are millions of people that we all, if we think about it, should be grateful for. Yet how often do we bother to say, thank you? Thank you for doing that. I often like to remind people how ungrateful those of a very collectivist persuasion tend to be. Just take one of the most collectivists ever, Karl Marx. You know something of what his message was all about. Can you imagine Karl Marx ever going into a hardware store, walking up to the owner and saying, hey, I just wanted to say thank you for taking the risk, building this enterprise, giving all these people an opportunity to have a job, putting all these products on the shelf that I can just walk in and purchase at the drop of a hat. Thank you for doing that. Can you imagine him ever? There's no record that he ever did anything like that. Because, again, liberty was not his philosophy of life, needless to say. With that, I just want to wrap it up by saying, remember, you are in charge. There's so much about your life that's yet to come that you can make a difference with, that you can shape. You can be the person you choose to be. And I hope you will all put both character and liberty on the highest pedestals as you decide what kind of life you want to live and what kind of person you want to be. Thank you so much.